There is a number that the Soviet Union never wanted you to know. Not the number of dead, a different number. The number of years scientists say one place on Earth will stay too dangerous for a human being to stand on without dying slowly from the inside. That number is 20,000. 20,000 years. Long after every person watching this, every grandchild of every grandchild has lived and died, a melted mass of nuclear fuel will still be sitting under a steel dome in northern Ukraine, waiting. We were told that story ended in 1986. It didn't. But to understand how something like that could happen, you have to understand the world it happened in. Because Chernobyl wasn't an accident that fell out of the sky. It was the product of a country and a century that had backed itself into a corner. By 1986, the Soviet Union was an empire running on fumes, even if almost nobody outside the Kremlin was allowed to say so. For 4 decades, it had been locked in a silent war with the United States, not fought with soldiers crossing borders, but with bombs nobody dropped, and a race nobody could afford to lose. The Cold War. 2 systems, 2 ways of life, each one convinced the other was a lie waiting to collapse. And nuclear power sat right at the center of that rivalry. To the Soviets, a reactor wasn't just a machine that made electricity. It was proof. Proof that communism could outbuild, outthink, and outlast the West. Moscow needed the lights to stay on in 100 cities, yes, but it also needed the world to look at its reactors and see strength, not desperation. That pressure came from the very top, and it traveled all the way down to a power plant near a quiet town called Pripyat, built to house the workers and their families. A modern town, a proud town. The kind of place the Soviet Union liked to point to and say, look, this is what we built. Nobody in Pripyat believed anything was wrong. That's where this story really begins. Pripyat was supposed to be the future. Built in 1970, less than 2 miles from the reactor, it was what the Soviets called an atomgrad. An atomic city, wide boulevards, new apartment blocks with hot water that actually worked. A Ferris wheel going up in the town park, set to open in just a few days for the May Day holiday. Schools, a hospital. Nearly 50,000 people, most of them young. The average age in Pripyat was 26, living what felt, to them, like a privileged life inside a closed, controlled, deeply ordinary world. And that's the detail people forget when they talk about Chernobyl. They imagine it as some grim, gray, forgotten outpost. It wasn't. It was new. It was hopeful. The engineers who worked at the plant were considered elite, chosen, trained, trusted with one of the most advanced technologies their country had ever built. Reactor number 4 had only been running for 2 years. It was, by every official measure, a triumph. Now here's where I want you to lean in close. Because the thing that destroyed Pripyat wasn't a bomb, and it wasn't sabotage, and it wasn't some wild act of nature. It was a test. A routine, scheduled safety test, the kind of thing that happens at power plants all over the world, even today. The question they were testing was almost philosophical in its simplicity. If the plant suddenly lost power, if the lights went out, so to speak, could the spinning turbines keep generating just enough electricity for just long enough to keep the safety systems alive until the backup generators kicked in? It sounds careful. It sounds responsible. And in a different country, under different pressure, with different men running the control room that night, it might have stayed exactly that. A quiet technical exercise, finished by midnight, forgotten by morning. But this test had already failed 3 times before. In 1982, 1984, and 1985. Each time something went wrong, and each time the test was rescheduled, patched over, and quietly buried in paperwork. Nobody wanted to be the one to say out loud that there might be something deeper wrong with the reactor itself. Not in a system where admitting failure could end a career, or worse. So on April 25th, 1986, they tried again, a 4th time. And this time the test would not be postponed. It would be finished, no matter what. That decision, the decision to push forward instead of stopping, is where the real story of Chernobyl begins. Not in the explosion itself, but in the hours leading up to it. when a series of small, human, almost forgivable choices started stacking on top of each other like dominoes nobody could see falling. The plan was simple: lower the reactor's power output gradually in a controlled way down to a safe testing level. Then run the experiment, record the data, and bring everything back up to normal by the end of the night shift. But the day shift handed the job to the evening shift. The evening shift handed it to the night shift. And the night shift, the least experienced crew, working in the deepest, darkest hours of the morning, the hours when the human body is at its weakest and slowest, inherited a test that had already gone sideways once that day, when a regional power grid operator unexpectedly asked the plant to delay the shutdown by nearly 10 hours to keep electricity flowing to homes and factories. 10 hours. That single delay would change everything about who was standing in that control room when it happened, and what kind of night they were having before it did. By the time the test finally resumed, it was 1:23 in the morning, and the men in that control room were about to make decisions that would outlive every single one of them. Let's stop here for a moment, because I want you to really see this room. It's just past 1 in the morning. Fluorescent lights humming overhead. Dials, switches, gauges, hundreds of them, most of them analog, most of them requiring a trained human eye to interpret correctly. And standing in front of all of it is a shift that, by any honest account, was not the team you'd want running a high-stakes experiment on one of the most complex machines ever built. The shift supervisor that night, a man named Anatoly Dyatlov, was experienced, but experienced in a way that made him impatient and dangerously confident. He had a reputation for pushing through problems rather than stopping to question them. The reactor's chief engineer on duty had been on the job only a few months. Some of the operators had limited specific training on reactor number 4's particular quirks. And this reactor, the RBMK design, had quirks that, we now know, made it especially unforgiving of mistakes. Here's the part almost nobody explains clearly, so let me try. Most reactors are designed so that if something starts going wrong, the physics of the reactor itself fights back. It naturally calms down, the way a fire starves itself of oxygen. But the RBMK reactor, especially at very low power, behaved differently. At low power, under certain conditions, it could become unstable in a way that worked backwards. The kind of fault where, instead of correcting itself, the reaction could start to feed on its own heat and grow. It was, in the language of nuclear engineers, a design with what's called a positive void coefficient at low power. I won't dwell on the physics, because what matters here isn't the formula. What matters is this: the machine had a known, documented weakness, buried in technical reports that very few people in that control room that night had ever been told to fear. They didn't know they were standing on something that could turn against them. So when the 10-hour delay pushed the test into the dead of night, and the reactor's power dropped lower than planned, accidentally sliding into that unstable zone, the operators didn't panic. They didn't fully understand the danger. They simply tried to fix it the way you'd fix any technical problem: by adjusting, by compensating, by pulling out more of the control rods that absorb the nuclear reaction, to try and bring the power back up to where the test required it to be. This is the moment I want you to really sit with, because in hindsight, with everything we know now, it looks like recklessness. But in that room, in that moment, it looked like problem solving. It looked like exactly what any trained operator would do when a number on a dial wasn't where it was supposed to be. They pulled the rods. The power started climbing back, and at 1:23 in the morning, satisfied the reactor was finally stable enough, they began the test. They shut off the steam to the turbine, just as planned. The turbine began to slow down, just as expected, and for a moment, a real, true moment, everything was going according to procedure. Then the power began to rise, not gently, not in the way a dial creeps upward when you nudge it. It began to climb, fast, faster than anyone in that room had seen a reactor move before. Someone shouted to press the emergency shutdown button, the one final safety measure, designed to drop every control rod back into the reactor core at once and kill the reaction instantly. The button had a name. Operators called it AZ5. It was supposed to save them. Instead, because of a flaw in the design of the control rods themselves, a flaw nobody in that room had any way of knowing about, pressing that button did the opposite of what it was built to do. For a few fatal seconds, it made things worse. Here's the cruelty of it, and I mean that word carefully. The control rods were supposed to drop down into the reactor core and absorb the runaway reaction, smothering it the way you'd smother a fire. But the tips of those rods, the very first part to enter the core, were made of graphite. And graphite, in this particular design, didn't slow the reaction down at all. It accelerated it. For just a handful of seconds, as the rods began their descent, they pushed reactivity upward instead of downward. In a reactor that was already climbing out of control, that was the final shove. The power surged to roughly 100 times its normal level, almost instantly. What happened next took less time than it takes to read this sentence. The fuel inside the reactor overheated so violently it began to fracture and vaporize, and the resulting pressure had nowhere to go. At 1:23 and 44 seconds, 40 seconds after the test began, there was an explosion. Then, 2 or 3 seconds later, a second, far larger one. The 1,500-ton steel and concrete lid covering the reactor, the lid meant to seal it shut forever from the world, was thrown into the air like it weighed nothing at all. The roof was gone, the walls were gone, and what remained open to the night sky over Pripyat was the glowing, exposed core of a nuclear reactor, burning. I want you to picture this honestly, because most people picture Chernobyl as a single fireball. It wasn't, not exactly. Witnesses miles away described something stranger, something almost beautiful, in the way that only true horror can be beautiful. A column of light, blue-white, rising straight up into the dark sky above the plant. Some later believed it was ionized air, the radiation itself lighting up the atmosphere like a flame with no fuel. Others in town simply saw it as a fire, a big one, the kind you'd want to go watch from your balcony. And that's exactly what some of them did. In Pripyat, less than 2 miles away, people stepped outside in their pajamas to look. Couples stood on balconies. Parents woke their children, not in fear, but in wonder, to see the strange glowing light on the horizon. Nobody told them to go back inside. Nobody told them, because nobody yet understood, that the air drifting toward their open windows was now carrying invisible particles that would settle into their lungs, their thyroids, their bone marrow, and stay there. Meanwhile, at the plant itself, firefighters were already racing toward the burning reactor. The very same firefighters who had no idea, none at all, that what they were running toward wasn't an ordinary fire. They climbed onto rooftops coated in radioactive debris. They worked for hours in clothing that offered no protection whatsoever against what was actually killing them. Within weeks, many of those men would be gone. And here is the part of this story that I think says more about human nature than almost anything else in it. For the first crucial hours, even the people running the plant, the engineers, the supervisors, men with degrees in training and decades of experience, refused to believe the reactor itself had exploded. It seemed impossible. Soviet reactors didn't fail like that. They'd been told that, trained on that, built their entire careers on that belief. So instead of treating it like the worst nuclear accident in human history, in those first hours, they treated it like a fire that needed to be put out. That single human refusal to accept what they were seeing, that's what cost the most time. And time that night was the one thing nobody could afford to lose. By morning, the city of Pripyat was still living a completely ordinary day. Children went to school. Mothers hung laundry outside on balconies that were already coated with an invisible, lethal dust. A wedding somewhere in the region went ahead as planned. The photographs from that day later becoming some of the eeriest images in modern history. People smiling, dancing, completely unaware that the air around them was no longer the air they thought it was. Soviet authorities knew, within hours, that something catastrophic had happened. And they made a choice that, in many ways, defines this entire story more than the explosion itself did. They said nothing. For 36 hours, the nearly 50,000 residents of Pripyat were left in their homes, breathing radioactive air, while officials in Moscow debated quietly what, if anything, to tell the public. It wasn't until the morning of April 27th, more than a full day later, that buses finally arrived to evacuate the town. Residents were told to pack only what they needed for 3 days. Take your documents, they said. Leave the rest. You'll be back soon. They were never coming back. Most of them didn't know that yet. Some of them, even now, still struggle to fully accept it. And here's where the silence became something even larger. 2 days after the explosion, on April 28th, a routine radiation monitoring station in Sweden, nearly 700 miles away, picked up radiation levels far above normal on the clothing of its own workers. Sweden, a country with no nuclear accident of its own, began asking urgent questions. Soviet officials, even then, initially denied anything had happened at all. It was only after international pressure became impossible to ignore that the Kremlin issued a brief, 18-second statement on state television. An accident had occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the reactors had been damaged. Measures were being taken. 18 seconds for an event that would eventually force the evacuation of over 100,000 people, contaminate an area roughly the size of a small country, and release radioactive material that drifted across borders the Soviet Union had spent decades defending with soldiers and walls and ideology, into countries it considered its rivals, its enemies, and its allies alike, all at once, indiscriminately, the way radiation has never once in its history cared about a border on a map. May Day arrived 3 days after the explosion, and in Kiev, less than 70 miles from the still-burning reactor, the annual parade went ahead exactly as scheduled. Children marched, flags waved, officials stood and smiled for cameras, because canceling it would have meant admitting publicly, undeniably, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The need to appear strong, even as the ground beneath them was poisoned, says something about that era that no statistic ever could. By now, you might be asking yourself the question that sits underneath this entire story, the one I think you came here to find an answer to. How does an empire let this happen to its own people? The honest answer is the one we're going to spend the rest of this video unpacking, because it wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was something more familiar than that, something almost recognizable in our own lives, in our own decisions, in the moments we've all had where admitting a mistake felt harder than living with the consequences of it. That, more than the reactor, is what truly exploded that night. In the weeks that followed, the Soviet Union did something almost unimaginable in scale. They called it the liquidation, and the men sent to carry it out became known simply as the liquidators. Somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 people, soldiers, miners, engineers, even ordinary citizens pulled from their jobs, were sent into the contaminated zone over the following months and years. Their task was almost biblical in its scope. Bury the reactor, scrape the radioactive soil from entire towns, cut down and bury whole forests that had absorbed so much radiation, the leaves had turned an unnatural reddish-brown, a color that earned that section of woodland a nickname that has outlived almost everything else from that disaster, the Red Forest. Some of these men worked with nothing more than lead vests improvised from scrap metal, shoveling material so radioactive that exposure of even a few minutes carried consequences that would take years, sometimes decades, to fully arrive. Soldiers were nicknamed biorobots because the radiation was too intense in certain areas for actual robots. The machines sent in from West Germany and Japan to survive longer than a few hours before their electronics simply failed. So they sent men instead. They built what came to be called the sarcophagus, a hurried, massive structure of steel and concrete poured directly over the ruined reactor, built in just over 6 months by workers who, by some estimates, received in single shifts what should have been a lifetime's safe limit of radiation exposure. It wasn't built to last forever. It was built to buy time. Decades later, that original structure had begun to crack and crumble, forcing the construction of an entirely new containment shelter. An enormous arch, sliding into place in 2016, 30 years after the explosion, designed to hold for another 100 years. 100 years to contain something that will remain dangerous for 20,000. Let that math sit with you for a second, because that single number tells you something about Chernobyl that headlines and documentaries rarely manage to say plainly. We did not solve this. We contained it. We bought time, the way you might wrap a wound you can't actually heal. And the human cost behind that containment is still, to this day, genuinely contested. The official Soviet and later United Nations death toll attributed directly to the accident sits at a low number. Just a few dozen confirmed deaths in the immediate aftermath, mostly plant workers and firefighters. But other estimates drawn from rising cancer rates across Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia in the decades since suggest the true toll, the slow toll, the one written in thyroid cancer diagnoses in children who were toddlers in 1986, may run into the thousands, and some researchers argue far higher still. The truth is, nobody can give you a single, certain number. And maybe that uncertainty is the most honest thing anyone has ever said about Chernobyl. Some kinds of damage don't show up on a death certificate. They show up 30 years later in a hospital room, in a country that has long since stopped being the country it happened in. Pripyat itself was never reoccupied. Today it stands almost exactly as it was left. Apartment buildings hollowed out by time, a kindergarten with toys still scattered on the floor, that Ferris wheel in the town park, the one that was supposed to open for May Day in 1986, standing motionless, rusting, never having carried a single child. It became, without anyone planning it, one of the strangest places on Earth. A city frozen in the exact moment its future was taken from it. And if you've made it this far into this story with me, I want to pause for just a moment, because there's something I'd genuinely like to ask of you. If this kind of story means something to you, if you find yourself drawn to the moments in history where ordinary people had to face something almost too large to understand, I'd really love for you to consider subscribing to this channel and joining us here every day. We tell these stories because we believe they deserve to be remembered properly, with care, not just as headlines, but as something closer to the truth. And I'll be honest with you, the part of this story I find hardest to shake isn't the explosion. It's the ordinary mornings that followed it. The children walking to school, the wedding photographs, the parade that went on as scheduled. Because most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, have lived some version of that same morning, going through the motions of a normal day, while something underneath us was already quietly changing everything. That's the part of Chernobyl that never really left. Because the most dangerous thing that happened that night wasn't only the explosion in the reactor, it was everything that came after it. The silence, the denial, the slow decades-long discovery of just how far that night reached. And it reaches further than almost anyone has ever told you. So where is all of it now? That's the question this story keeps circling back to, and it's the one most people never actually get an answer to. The exclusion zone, the roughly 1,000 square miles of land around the plant, considered too contaminated for permanent human life, still exists today, nearly 40 years later. It's not empty, not entirely. Scientists work inside it, in rotating shifts, studying something almost nobody predicted. In the near total absence of humans, wildlife didn't die out in that zone. It came back. Wolves, lynx, wild horses, even bears, species that hadn't been seen in that region in decades, moved in once people moved out. Researchers still argue, genuinely argue, over what that means. Whether it proves radiation's damage is overstated, or whether it simply proves that human presence, traffic, hunting, farming, was doing more harm to that land than even Chernobyl could. Either way, nature didn't ask anyone's permission. It just returned. The town of Pripyat itself has become something stranger than a memorial. It's become a kind of pilgrimage site. Tourists, before recent regional conflicts made access far more difficult, walked its empty streets with guides and radiation counters, photographing the kindergarten, the Ferris wheel, the peeling murals of children that still cover the walls of an empty nursery school. There's something almost uncomfortable in that, isn't there? Turning a tragedy into a destination. But maybe that discomfort is the point. Maybe a place like that is supposed to make you feel something you can't fully name. Inside the new containment arch, the one completed in 2016, that elephant's foot I mentioned at the very start of this video is still there. Still hot, still glowing faintly with its own heat, generated by radioactive decay that has no schedule, no deadline, no negotiation. The scientists who study it do so from a careful distance, sending in remote cameras rather than people, because direct exposure for even a few minutes remains capable of delivering a fatal dose. And the broader region has never fully escaped the shadow of that night either. Thyroid cancer rates in parts of Ukraine and Belarus, particularly among people who were children in 1986, remain measurably higher than the surrounding world. A slow-motion consequence still being studied, still being argued over by scientists who, in some cases, weren't even born when the reactor exploded. In recent years, the region has faced an entirely new kind of danger nobody saw coming back then. Military activity moving through the exclusion zone itself, soldiers, equipment, vehicles, disturbing soil and structures that had sat undisturbed for decades, raising fears, briefly, of contaminated dust being kicked back up into the air, into lungs, into a new generation that has nothing to do with 1986, except being unlucky enough to stand on the same ground. History, it turns out, doesn't always stay buried just because we'd like it to. So when people say Chernobyl ended in 1986, I think what they actually mean is this. The explosion ended in 1986. The fire was extinguished within days. The headlines moved on within a year. But the thing itself, the actual event, in every meaningful sense that matters to soil, to water, to a thyroid gland, to a forest that still glows faintly red in certain light, that never ended at all. It simply became quiet. And quiet, when it comes to something like this, has never once meant safe. There's a photograph that circulates sometimes of Pripyat's amusement park, taken from almost the exact angle a child would have seen it, walking toward it for the first time. The Ferris wheel sits there, rusted orange now, against a gray sky. It never opened, not once, not for a single child. I keep coming back to that image because I think it holds the whole story better than any number could. We tend to imagine disasters as loud, as something that announces itself, gives you time to run, time to decide. Chernobyl wasn't that. Chernobyl was a normal Friday night, a test that had been delayed before and would have been delayed again in almost any other version of that week. A room full of tired men trying to finish a job before their shift ended, the way tired men do in every country, in every decade, in jobs far smaller than this one. That's what makes it hard to put down once you've really looked at it. It wasn't a story about evil, it was a story about pressure. The pressure to look strong instead of admitting weakness. The pressure to finish instead of stopping. The pressure to believe your own systems couldn't fail you, even as every dial in front of you was quietly insisting otherwise. We like to believe history happens to other people, in other countries, under other governments, made of different stuff than us. Chernobyl doesn't let you believe that for very long. Because underneath the politics, underneath the Cold War, underneath every detail we've walked through tonight, it's a story about how easily an ordinary night can become the night everything changes, and how long the world keeps paying for the hours right after, when the truth was known and chosen to be hidden anyway. Pripyat is still there. The forest is still red, in patches, if you know where to look. The elephant's foot is still warm, somewhere under steel that didn't exist when it first formed. And somewhere, in a filing cabinet that probably doesn't even exist anymore, there's a number, 20,000 years, that very few people ever had to reckon with until tonight. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while researching it, I'd ask you for two small things. Follow this channel so the next story like this one finds you. And if there's someone in your life who'd sit with this kind of history the way you just did, send it to them. 5 people. That's all. 5 conversations this might start. Tell me, in the comments, the one detail from tonight that you can't quite shake. And tell me what you'd like us to go looking for next. Because some places don't need ghosts to feel haunted. Some places just need to be remembered correctly.